Affairs Committee in our last public evidence session of the year, and we're really thrilled to be joined by two of our top academics to help us with our devolution after 25 years. And I'll now let them introduce themselves, where they're from, and anything by way of a short introductory statement. And we'll start with you, Dr. Brown-Swan.
Great. So I'm Corey Brown-Swan. I'm currently a lecturer in British politics at Stirling University and director of the Scottish Political Archive there. I was formerly at Queen's University Belfast and then Edinburgh's Centre on Constitutional Change, so I've kind of ping-ponged back and forth across the Irish Sea. I work across the politics of independence and union with a specific focus on intergovernmental relations, and with Nicola working on issues of economic union and comparative perspectives on economic union and internal markets.
Okay, thank you. Professor McEwen.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Professor Nicola McEwen. I am Director of the Centre for Public Policy at the University of Glasgow, having until recently been Professor of Territorial Politics at the University of Edinburgh. I moved along the M8 earlier in the year. Thank you very much for agreeing to allow me to give evidence to you online today. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but I very much look forward to the discussion, having worked on intergovernmental relations for a number of years now. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you both very much. And yes, Professor McEwen is joining us online, and Dr. Brown-Swan is with us. Just to get things started, we'll start with you, Dr. Corey Swan. You've obviously been looking at some of our sessions as we've been conducting this, and we've received quite a lot of interesting evidence just about how the 25 years has worked out. Just what's your view about how things have developed from the early days of the Scottish Parliament, where it was the same government in power in London, Edinburgh and Glasgow, to the situation we have now, where there's different governments right across every devolved assembly in the UK. I mean, what would your assessment and take be of where we are currently just now, and maybe, if you want, just to talk us through what you see as that journey to where we are at this point in time?
Sure. I was reading something recently. It was the House of Lords report from 2002, which offered a critique of intergovernmental relations as overly reliant on goodwill and mutual trust and understanding without the proper institutional structures. And I was really struck by, we've been talking particularly as a result of the Brexit process of the strain that's placed on intergovernmental relations. But those issues were there from the very start. I think there were two assumptions made in the early years of devolution. Firstly, that the devolution settlement was sufficiently clear, that the competencies were adequately delineated between reserved and devolved powers, that you wouldn't need a huge amount of intergovernmental working. And at least until 2007, there was a preference for handling any issues as intra-party issues rather than intergovernmental issues, negotiated between representatives with common relationships, common trust, common interest. And once we see that political divergence, when we see party incongruence between Cardiff, London and Edinburgh, we see that change in the system of intergovernmental relations. The Institute for Government has done some really interesting work cataloguing meetings of the JMC plenary, so the Joint Ministerial Committee plenary session, and these really fell into disuse in the early 2000s, before meeting much more frequently under the coalition government. So we see these institutional structures were always there, but there wasn't a political imperative to use them. And I think that left relationships, it made things quite difficult when things became much more contentious, because the relationships, because inter-institutional structures didn't exist.
Do you think that perhaps in the early days of devolution, we discussed this with former colleagues who were involved politically at that point, do you think that, in your view, that there should have been more resilience built into intergovernment relations and infrastructure, that there should have been perhaps the view taken that there would have been different governments and different institutions across the United Kingdom, and was it adequate when devolution kicked off that it would deal with these eventualities?
I think that was an omission, and I'm not quite sure why. I read the evidence from that you took in terms of that, reflecting on the political process. I think there was perhaps a sense that this didn't need to be addressed in detail, and we see that when things are working, they're working. And when you can reach agreement, you can reach agreement. But when things become more contentious and more difficult, if those structures aren't there, it hinders the process.
And of course, there are things that we could never have taken into account of back in 1999, like an independence referendum, for example, and leaving the European Union. I mean, like there's no set of situation conditions that could easily anticipate that and account for it, and they could be built into any infrastructure, I would imagine.
Absolutely.
Yep. And what about you, Professor McEwen? You've obviously been there for the full journey from the late 1990s all the way through. What's your observations about where we started to where we are just now, and like, what's your impressions about the journey that we have been on in terms of how governments have related to each other throughout the 25 years?
Yes, thank you for making me feel old. I mean, I think it's, you talked with Corey there about should things have been foreseen that you might need more of a system to work together. Perhaps, but I think it was inevitable given that the Scottish Parliament and the other devolved legislatures, but in particular the Scottish Parliament, came about as the outcome of a decades-long campaign to create institutions for self-government. So for all of the players, those that would go on to serve within the Scottish Parliament, those who were within the UK government, designing the system, all of the focus was on creating those new institutions and the powers and responsibilities that they would have. So I mean, I think the architects of devolution could perhaps be forgiven then for not paying sufficient attention to the flip side of that, to the way you counterbalance what in political science terms we call self-rule with mechanisms and processes to facilitate shared rule. Now, one of the observations I would make over the last few years is the increased recognition about the importance of having those shared rule processes. And that's partly because of the normality of party political differences in the administrations. It's also because of various committees, including your own Lord's Constitution Committee in particular, in the first instance, bringing the issues to the agenda, but also because of the complexities that have emerged in the system. It was always a bit of an exaggeration, I think, to consider devolution as clearly delineating reserved powers and devolved powers. I think there was always an intersection there that needed to be managed, but it's way more complex now, and it's way more complex, A, because of Brexit, but B, also because in Scotland of the 2016 settlement. And that's what the Smith Commission in particular had identified as presenting a need to scale up intergovernmental relations significantly.
I was at a recent parliamentary forum in the Scottish Parliament involving select committee chairs from across all the parliaments and assemblies in the UK and the House of Lords, and like the sense that came away from that meeting was intergovernment relations have never been in such a poor condition, that there's huge distrust right across all the capital cities of the United Kingdom when it comes to governance just now. Is that something that you share? And if that is the case, I mean, how did we get to that situation?
Sorry.
No, go for it.
Oh, Nicola, and you go.
Sorry. I mean, yes, there is a lot of distrust, without a doubt, and perhaps I know the Scottish Affairs Committee, but it's actually insightful, I think, to also look at the relationship between the UK government and the Welsh government. So it's not all about the constitution when there are issues of mistrust. And I know that you've discussed the Welsh First Minister's thoughts on these as well. So I think seeing the change in that relationship, I think, is an indication of the broader areas of mistrust. Having said that, it would be wrong to conclude that there isn't positive working taking place. There is a lot of positive working still amongst officials. That's part of their core business. But also sometimes at the ministerial level as well. We can point to some examples of that.
Okay, Dr. Brent-Swan.
I think I would agree. I think the tone of between at kind of executive level of intergovernmental relations is quite poor. You see this breakdown in trust, and part of that is perhaps kind of it's the partisan dynamic. It's viewing things through the lens of the constitutional question in Scotland. But I think Nicola is absolutely right to say that this is not just because of the dynamics of who's in government in Edinburgh and London that you see the similar dynamic playing out with Wales. But again, I wonder if some of that is at the kind of civil service level, if some of that is a result of a maturation of devolution, that the institutions have matured, they've kind of come of age, perhaps asserted their autonomy to a greater degree, and you don't have those ongoing relationships between civil servants as well in terms of the movement of people between places and those personal ties and professional working relationships that can help underpin some of those relations or dynamics.
And that's certainly something that's come out very clear in the evidence. There's a distinction between some of the political discourse that goes on around the Constitution, constitutional affairs, and what's happening within the civil service. I think you're right to characterise that as good working arrangements, which seems to be coming out again. But we've got the new review of the new system in intergovernment relations just in January 2022, and at the heart of that it contains a commitment from the four governments to maintain positive and constructive relations and trust. Do you think the new IGR machinery has helped achieve that? And I think, I'm just looking at some of the reviews of this since 2022. It's mixed. It's not as gloomy and pessimistic as you would expect. There's actually a lot of positivity from both the Scottish and UK governments. The Welsh don't seem to enjoy it as much. But what's your view about what you've observed? And we'll start with you, Dr. Brown-Swan, with the new arrangements that are in place.
Sure. I think it is quite early days, so I'd be hesitant to kind of render a verdict one way or another. But I do think the agreement represents a really positive step, particularly as we move out of this political period, which has been so dominated first by Brexit and then by COVID. So perhaps that offers an opportunity for kind of a little bit more normal politics. I might kind of knock on wood here. But we see the first meetings of the Prime Minister and heads of devolved governments held in November 2022. Notably, there hasn't been one yet this calendar year, and the clock is ticking, but we see the interministerial working groups meeting much more regularly. Some of those built on established ties that people have already been working well together. So we can see, I did kind of a tally of who had been meeting, which groups had been meeting, and some of them, those built on those existing ties and existing relationships, which I think is probably to be expected. I think the structures seem fairly solid. They were really informed by extensive consultation and consideration. But political culture and political dynamics and partisan dynamics will play a role. So you can have this quite extensive machinery, especially when we compare it to what came before. But it's what we do with those tools that matters the most.
What do you make of it, Professor McEwen? And I'm just noting after Dr. Brown-Swan's comment there that the last time, the big innovation, I suppose, in the new arrangements is the Prime Minister and heads of devolved governments council. It's met once, and that was November last year. I mean, what's the point of creating all this new infrastructure if it's not going to convene and meet?
So I think it should convene and meet, and I think it does have a point. I think that the processes and the procedures can help to underpin the relationship, particularly in challenging times. But we shouldn't expect too much of formal machinery either. Political relationships are going to be improved when there is the will to improve them on the part of the players. One of the things that's interesting for me about the new machinery is that it's obviously being used in a very variable ways. So some meeting more regularly, some less frequently, and some appear still to have to be set up. And it's not quite clear why that variation is there and is evident. The ones, as Corey said, the ones that are meeting had a culture of meeting already. And one of the things that's interesting for me there is that, and I'm thinking more of in the environment and rural affairs space, where maybe it's a consequence of that regularity of meeting, that these are also the forums where there tends to be more of a shared understanding of devolution.
Yeah.
And of the respective roles of the different administrations. And I think that's really important. And if meeting and regularity of meeting can help to foster and nurture that, then I think it is to be valued. But obviously, it has to be used, and it's notable from the dashboard that we now get of the intergovernmental meetings that most of them, there's a lot of meetings taking place,
Yeah.
but most of them are not taking place within the new formal machinery. And again, I don't know why that is the case, but there we have it. So I think you're roughly 60 meetings a quarter, and about 12 of those are using the new machinery.
We'll come.
So, sorry, go ahead.
Well, we'll come to the issues around transparency, because I think that's quite important. And there was a commitment when all this was being set up to become a lot more transparent. People could see how all this sort of stuff was decided and worked out. But your point there about EFRA meeting regularly, I think is a point taken. Again, we've seen that reference in a lot of the evidence that's come to us. But committees like Justice and Health haven't even been properly set up yet. I mean, surely the governments, and we're talking about governments here who were committed to doing this properly, would make sure that these were set up and attended and doing their job. And isn't it a failing that we've so far got to the stage where very little is actually happening in the formal way, leaving aside all the informal meetings and positive work that's been done?
Well, I mean, it may be that, obviously moving towards the end of this parliamentary term and looking ahead to the next one, it may be that if you are to have a Secretary of State with responsibility for intergovernmental relations, it might be better for that not to be housed within a portfolio department, so that it is, so when that was within Cabinet Office, you have evidently a role and reach across the administration, so that may make it easier to do things at that more strategic level. So I don't know if part of the reason why we're not seeing consistency is because you don't have that strategic lead at a departmental level that has reach across government. But it's certainly something that I would like to see in the next session.
Okay, any thoughts, Dr. Brown-Swan?
No, I agree with that. I think there are opportunities, but it does come from leadership and whether that's a priority and understandings of devolution and engagement with the devolved governments and administrations is a priority for that government or that leader.
Thank you very much. Sally Ann Hart.
Thank you, Chair. Just looking at the intergovernmental relations framework, I know our Chair has asked some questions on this, but just to push a bit further, looking at the commitment from the four governments to maintain positive and constructive relations and trust, is the success of the arrangements dependent on political tolerance? For example, we have Wales, we're talking about Scotland. There are different political parties, and the SNP has a drive towards independence. Is that a blocker to constructive relations, no matter which party is in government in the UK?
I don't think so. I mean, when we think about the kind of resurgence of or increased attention to intergovernmental relations, arguably the intergovernmental relations that underpinned the Edinburgh Agreement, which made an independence referendum possible, were between two parties very much opposed to one another on the question of independence. And you saw quite productive, quite solid working. Obviously, that's been tested and strained. But I think on a lot of the issues, we have this kind of looming constitutional question, but on a lot of the issues around environment, on agriculture, etc., there's probably a greater degree of consensus and a common ground can be found. And when we see kind of negotiating things post-Brexit, A lot of the issues that governments have to come to agreement on are pretty technical, or are kind of outside that political sphere.
Professor McEwen.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's the case. I often hear it said that, you know, the SNP administration, because it's pro-independence, it doesn't want intergovernmental relations to work, and I really don't think that is the case. I don't think it invests as much in the system as the Welsh government does, because the Welsh Labour government, from its perspective, needs intergovernmental relations to work. But I think certainly a wise administration, pro-independence or not, would invest in making the system work, because there is an inbuilt dependence there. The devolved governments need IGR more than the UK government needs IGR, because they are dependent for resource, they are dependent for information flow, they are trying to influence decisions that will have an impact on their own responsibilities and their roles. So I think if it wouldn't be a very robust system if it only worked when the political players agreed with each other, whether it was that was on policy or constitution. So it has to be designed to work in the context of very different outlooks, not least because whatever the constitutional arrangements of these islands, and you know that may well be in the future some fundamentally different relationship. Even in that context, there will still be issues that require cooperation and coordination by virtue of geography and sharing these islands. So I think there needs to be a system that is robust, and it's in everybody's interest that is the case.
Thank you. So what sort of mindset do the UK and the Scottish governments need to adopt in order to encourage effective intergovernmental relations? Professor McEwen.
So I think respect, mutual respect. I noted with interest the submission that you received from David Cameron before he was in the government again, but reflecting back on his own time, and he talked a lot about the respect agenda, and that was real in the sense that made a difference compared to what had been there before. So there's definitely something about respecting the autonomy of each of the administrations, actually, but also the legitimate interests that each has in those areas that affect their autonomy. So that's one thing, I think. We've talked a lot about trust, and trust is really important. But you can't just decide that you trust. You have to build that, and you know it's a much more organic thing. And I think that comes from the shared experiences of working together. One thing I would add is that I think there are numerous examples now, even in the sort of heated political context in which we find ourselves, that suggest that intergovernmental relations works well when the governments have a job to do. So, you know, I'm thinking of, you know, positive examples recently are around the renewal of the fiscal framework agreement, or the joint approach to Homes for Ukraine. You know, these were projects, concrete things that they could work together on and collaborate on, and that tends to be when it works better and when you can build trust. That's genuinely a joint endeavour.
Do you think that to be effective, then there should be projects worked on together? So there should be a pipeline of projects that can be delivered between the governments, and they work together on it to promote, you know, we respect the devolved administrations, they have their autonomy, but actually it will promote better working relationships and better unity across the UK if they have projects they work on together.
Provided that's not just in areas of devolved competence. So if you take, say, an issue like net zero, okay, so net zero is a big challenge facing all of the governments, and that spans the areas of devolved and reserved competence, or poverty reduction, big issue, spans areas of devolved and reserved competence. And so I think where I was a little bit disappointed with the Common Frameworks process is that you started there with exactly the sort of thing we're talking about, finding ways that you might work together and collaborate and do things on a four-nation basis, if you like that phrase. And it didn't a priori have to always be in areas of devolved competence, but it ended up being. And then that starts to feel like, like a challenge to the autonomy of the devolved institutions. But if it's genuinely collaborative and spanning, addressing those policy challenges that span areas of devolved and reserved competence, then I think that is something that could be quite productive. Thank you. Dr. Brown-Swan.
I agree. I think there has to be that sense that everyone has a stake in the game, and if it's something that risks being perceived as an attempt by the UK government to force alignment or
do something
that would encroach perhaps on devolved competencies, I think that might risk undermining that project. So I do think that sense of stake and sense of willingness to compromise is really important. I think ideally, I guess one thing that stuck out at me when reflecting on intergovernmental relations and the quality of intergovernmental relations is differing opinions isn't necessarily a problem. It's not necessarily a sign of poor intergovernmental relations. The goal isn't necessarily to align everyone or come to a consensus, but it is to have those open and constructive sharing of positions within an environment that can facilitate that trust and mutual respect. So I think the emphasis on perhaps those conversations, even when those conversations are really difficult, even when there's not going to be policy alignment, or even when there's going to be disagreement, but can you work through those disagreements in a constructive, positive way?
Thank you. Just looking at the groups, the bodies, the intergovernmental and interministerial groups that work together, the chair highlighted that EFRA have met regularly, and also reasonably is the net zero energy and climate change. So that's obviously got a common policy aims to reach net zero by 2050. Whereas for other departments, it's not. Meetings are not frequent, or they've yet to be established. Is it because there's less coordination required, or is it due to political differences? Why is it? Why have we not seen those meetings?
I think it's probably a mix of both. I did kind of a similar tally on the train down this morning, and we have education, which has met 4 times, tourism, which has met only once. So we see in contrast to EFRA, which was 15, and net zero, which was 12. So we see that spectrum. Part of it is probably a sense of that these things are devolved, that they don't necessarily require coordination. It might be a nice thing to come together and talk about common challenges in education, the way that we're kind of helping children catch up post-COVID, etc. But it's not seen as a political necessity or a political imperative. And then there might be issues within individual departments, whether there's a political will or desire or capacity as well. It's been a busy few years to set up those groups to engage in that process. So I think there's probably a mixed explanation there between political will and capacity and need.
So looking at the point where you've got devolved administrations who have their autonomy in their devolved areas, education being one of them, there's been no meetings on that. But do you think it would be pertinent, and looking at the fact that we don't want the UK government to be seen as if they're doing something to, would it be for the devolved nations, in this case Scotland, approaching the UK government to have meetings about an area which is in their remit, rather than the UK government suggesting an intergovernmental meeting? I mean, where would that promotion or proactivity be best coming from? I don't know if you or Professor McEwen wants to take that first.
I think it could come from either direction, but I think there is a question of these structures are in many ways. We see the rotating chairs, we see an independent secretariat, but they are structures kind of developed at the centre, so perhaps it's on the centre to take the initiative there. I think there are probably opportunities for policy learning and devolved nations and the central government to learn from one another, which are perhaps a shame to miss out if you don't have these forums to discuss and to share. But I think there's a challenge there if the Department for Education isn't used to working on devolved issues, isn't used to thinking about devolution, what's the political imperative or what's the incentive to engage with it?
Okay.
Yeah.
Professor McEwen, do you have anything to add?
I mean, I think, yeah. So, I mean, I think it's important to have a purpose for meetings, and broadly that purpose is an agreed one. I was struck by Lord Wallace's recollections, and he was talking about the prime ministerial level meetings of where, you know, they met a few times and they had nothing to do and people stared out the window, and there's no point in meeting unless there is a clear and shared and joint purpose. That might be working on something together. It might be, and often is when the devolved governments initiate something that they an ask that they have or a complaint that they have, or, you know, it might be that there is, you know, a particular policy learning or where there's been an innovation in public policy and the other administrations want to be and are open to learning about that and sharing practice. So, I mean, I personally would like to see the devolved governments initiate more in that space. I think one of the real pluses of the new machinery was that it was more, it relied less on Whitehall to initiate, and hopefully once the Secretariat is up and running, that there's a bit more resource made available to all of the administrations where they do want to initiate something. But again, they're not going to do it for the sake of it. There has to be something concrete to make for a meaningful discussion.
So, for example, if we're looking at education, which has devolved, we've got a problem with school absenteeism across the UK. Would that be a sort of common issue that they could get together on and think, right, okay, where's best working? Is that what you're sort of suggesting?
I mean, possibly, although a lot of that in practice, presumably, I'm not an expert, but presumably would be at the local authority level. But, you know, I'm thinking, you know, something like, so that, yes, education is devolved, but there are clearly aspects of that where the boundaries are a bit more fuzzy, particularly around higher education, for example. So there may be, and there are also intersections between policy areas and others. So again, thinking of higher education has an intersection with some of the responsibilities of the Home Office or of external relations. So you know, it's I suppose the downside of thinking about things purely in that sort of functional portfolio level relationship is that you don't maybe see some of those complexities in the bigger picture quite as much, and you know, public policy challenges are sometimes a bit more complex.
Okay, so looking at interministerial groups, what level of ministerial seniority should attend these groups and the interministerial standing committees? And are they given enough priority by both UK and Scottish governments? Dr. Brown-Swan.
Right, and I think it depends on the policy area and the policy function. If it's something quite niche, it's probably better to have people who are much more focused, even if they are at a lower level of seniority, who are much more focused and able to speak to those issues directly. Looking at the kind of skimming through some of the communiques, you see kind of a mix of seniorities present in meetings, and it does seem to be dependent on what's discussed, but also who is available for those. So I don't think it would make sense to kind of prescribe a level, but understand that sometimes if you're speaking about the kind of overarching, the wider issues, something writ large, it makes sense to have the minister there. In other cases, it might make sense to have people who are more on top of the technical day-to-day detail.
Like the civil servants, for example.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Professor McEwen, do you have anything to add?
I do. Yes, I agree with that. I think roles and responsibilities should be intertwined for the most part. The one exception is that I do think it is important that the Prime Minister attends the Prime Minister and Heads of Government Council, and that's been one of the biggest failings, I suppose, of the implementation of the joint review since it was presented, is that current Prime Minister obviously had one meeting, and it was quite early on in his premiership, and that was received very positively within the devolved institutions, but then it never really happened again thereafter. Neither of his predecessors invested any time or inclination into nurturing those relationships, and it's notable from the evidence to the COVID inquiry that the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson described it as optically wrong in the first place for the UK Prime Minister to hold regular meetings with the devolved administration First Ministers. So that's clearly something that he felt it was inappropriate, which, if you put the UK into a comparative context, does look really quite unusual. And I think for these relationships to work and to be seen as a fundamental part of the United Kingdom as it is configured politically, I think it's really important for the head of the government, for the Prime Minister to, even once a year, to take part in the formal forum of intergovernmental relations with the other leaders.
Sorry, just you said taken in the comparative context. Comparing with who? Whom? Which country?
So other countries with multi-level government. Now, they may be federations. So in Canada, for example, or Australia, they may be systems that have something more akin to devolution, as in Spain. So where you design a system, a political system that is intended to share power or disperse power between different centres of power, I suppose, throughout the country, where you're recognising that, and where there are those within the authority of their respective governments who are First Ministers, it's, I think, important to the success of that system to maintain a working relationship with the Prime Minister. And I think it would be a signal of intent, as indeed it was when the current Prime Minister did attend that meeting. It was a signal of intent that reflected the importance that they invested in that relationship. Theresa May, as Prime Minister, did it, and prior to this new machinery being up and running, when there was the Joint Ministerial Committee plenary. And I think it's whoever is the holder of that post going forward. I think I would suggest it's an important investment of time.
Thank you. I was just going to say, how often do you think the Prime Minister should meet the First Ministers of the devolved nations?
The agreement once a year would be good.
Minimum of once a year. Ideally, how many times
Twice
a year?
Yeah, twice a year.
Twice a year.
I think annually it becomes just kind of a photo moment, and more substantive engagement would always be welcome.
Okay, no further questions.
Your answer to a clear question. Wendy, do you want to come in?
Thanks. Just briefly, I mean, what I'm interested in is the fact that obviously we had the agreement to review in 2018 and then the review being published in January 2022, which is obviously quite a long period of time now. I accept we had a degree of political upheaval as well as COVID in that. But I do wonder that impact of COVID, is that the reason why we're having more informal meetings that are not within the new framework? Because basically the IMGs that existed during COVID, that was how things got done. Has COVID had an impact on the success of the implementation of the new mechanisms? Dr. Brown-Swan.
Probably to agree, but I think there's always been those informal meetings that take place, and that's why one of the main challenges of intergovernmental relations from a parliamentary perspective is scrutiny, because so many of those meetings take place outside those forums and outside the kind of formal mechanisms of intergovernmental relations. Perhaps COVID, and we see this, a colleague works on mayors, and COVID was really helpful in terms of coordinating mayors and having more regular meetings, because it became normalized to meet informally, to meet via Zoom, via Teams, etc., as a way of facilitating those relationships. So perhaps a similar dynamic has played out with the devolved governments as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to our witnesses. First of all, Professor McEwen, you were speaking earlier about how obviously the relationship between the UK government and the devolved administrations, it could be improved, but then you spoke about it going from the devolved administrations to the UK government, and you felt that Labour-run Wales rather than SNP-run Scotland had, I think you said, worked better. Why would that be, and what's the motivation for the Scottish Government not to work as collaboratively as the Welsh Labour administration?
So that's not quite what I said.
No, well, I couldn't remember, so if you could repeat it then.
Yeah, so, I mean, if you are a government...
If you could just repeat what you said, because it was along those lines, so I just want to get that for the transcript.
So that's what I'm trying to do. If you are an administration that is invested in the success of the union, which the Welsh Government is invested in that, then it, I suppose, makes more sense that they would have done a lot of the thinking, the imaginative thinking about alternative models to do that. So in the early years of the Brexit process, the Welsh Government was the one that was putting forward a lot of suggestions for quite radical ways to reform the way business is done between the administrations. And there are a number of reports that they published that I would recommend going back and having a look at, because they were really very interesting and offering some new ways of working. Now, none of those were taken up.
Sorry to interrupt. Just to mention there, you'll know, and you'll go on to speak about it, the Scottish Government also produced several reports at that time.
It did,
Michael
but they
Russell
weren't on
did.
So yes, you're absolutely right, but in a different context. So you were talking about two administrations, not just one that is pro-independence and one that is pro-union, but one that was dealing with the fact that Wales had voted for Brexit and one that was dealing with the fact that Scotland had not. And so the reaction to the referendum and its aftermath was, initially at least, quite distinctive. The Scottish Government was kind of challenging the legitimacy of the process as it applied to Scotland, because they felt it wasn't they had to represent what the preference was for the people of Scotland. So they were looking for different ways to opt out of the process, whereas the Welsh Government was starting from a different perspective. Have to say, though, the Brexit process did see them work a lot together and share a lot of opinions and positions, actually, and approaches and frustrations that they collectively worked together on. So that did, interestingly, forge a stronger relationship bilaterally between the Scottish and Welsh governments.
But your comments then, just to be absolutely clear, are only about the workings of the respective Scottish and Welsh governments post the 2016 Brexit referendum?
In terms of intergovernmental relations.
Well, just in terms of, I'm trying to get a better feel as to why you felt one worked better with the other, and everything you've outlined is post-Brexit. Was that the change, or did you think actually the Scottish Government had opportunities from 07 to 16, when it was a nationalist government, to have done better with the UK Government in that period?
So I think there were some changes in that period, but I do think that the Brexit referendum and the process that unfolded from there added the sense of urgency for all of the administrations because of the removal of the EU regulatory framework that had provided a kind of scaffolding for devolution. So there needed to be some way of working together, and they all did that, particularly in the context of common frameworks, which were largely depoliticized in a sense that a lot of that was done by sort of middle-ranking civil servants rather than at the ministerial level. It was about process and procedure and often quite technical. But that was genuinely a cross-administration process that was productive. And I believe the frameworks that have been published now are used on a regular basis.
I'll stick with you, Professor McEwen, and then come to Dr. Brown-Swan in a moment. Last week we heard from the Secretary of State for Scotland about a range of issues within the Scotland office, not looking at the political element of any of these decisions. What is your take now that we're looking at 25 years of devolution, but the first usage of a Section 35 Act? How do you think both governments have worked with that on GRR and some of the issues that we've seen with the deposit return scheme as well? Professor McEwen.
So I think as I understand it, and a lot of this is not all that transparent, so my knowledge is partial. I think with deposit return, there seemed to be quite a lot of collaboration, again, with DEFRA and the Scottish Government throughout the process, and part of that regular engagement that they have. I think probably both of those things have highlighted, and there is clearly political tensions going on there, and I'll leave those aside. But one of the challenges that came through when I was doing lots of interviews with officials around intergovernmental relations is that there can be a frustration from the devolved governments when they are wanting they're wanting a response, and they have to wait on an issue going through the Whitehall machine. Then once positions are taken at the collective ministerial responsibility level, then you can't really change them. So there's something, what all of that tells me is that there's some need and opportunity to have engagement much, much earlier on in the process with all of those who will be the relevant players. And
as Alistair Jack explained last week, he couldn't really have those discussions on GRR because 12 months ago, the other parliament I sit in at Holyrood was still debating GRR and potentially changing it to such an extent that you can't actually make a significant decision until you know exactly what's going to come from the Scottish Parliament. Would that be fair?
Probably, and I for reasons that you might be sympathetic to, I've avoided that particular issue. But if I can focus more on the one that is more familiar to me around exemptions, the exemption process around the UK Internal Market Act, I think there is something that can be done there to make the process a bit clearer, not just about how you might secure an exemption, but how you might coordinate, and whether we can put some sort of procedure around the timescale, that what is shared, how long everything takes, because apart from anything else, it's an awful waste of resource if you get to this point in the process and then have to abandon a policy or feel that you have to abandon a policy at the end. So there's something about the process earlier on that could foster cooperation as well as facilitate autonomy.
Although again, before I take in Dr Brown-Swan, last week the Secretary of State confirmed that hundreds of businesses were grateful that he took the decision on DRS because of the issues that they had been raising with the Scottish Government that they felt were not listened to. Dr Brown-Swan, in these two policy areas, I don't want to get into the politics of it.
Of course. So I can't speak directly to those internal processes, but I think Nicola is right in saying this was the first kind of test of the UK in terms of bottle deposit or the deposit return scheme. It was the first real test of the Internal Market Act and the implications for regulatory divergence. We saw it with the single-use plastics in both Scotland and Wales. There were concerns expressed during that process of the timing it took to secure those exclusions. So hopefully there will be lessons learned outside of the kind of political wrangling over the specific policy areas, but there's lessons perhaps to be learned in how that process works and ensuring that process works smoothly, both to support the scrutiny and political process, but also that necessary certainty for those affected by policy and necessary certainty for businesses. Okay. So I think it was perhaps a bit of teething pains, really, to kind of put it at a most basic level in terms of the sense of this was the first time working through that process.
Okay, could I move on from the politics to the civil service? We have a UK-wide civil service. We have a Scottish civil service that supports the work of the Scottish Government, who are ultimately part of that UK-wide civil service. There's been a lot of discussion in Scotland this weekend about social media messages and posts that have been put up not by the SNP as the governing party in Scotland or their Green partners, but by the independent Scottish Government social media pages. I'll read one which says, "In the UK Government's autumn statement, only £10.8 million of extra funding was provided for the NHS for NHS Scotland next year." That's a lie. That is simply not true. I'm sure you'll both confirm that the UK Government give a block grant and it's up to then the Scottish Government how they spend that. Should language like that is clearly misleading, be used by an independent civil service run Scottish Government social media page? Dr Brown-Swan.
I missed out on this discourse at the weekend. I think there's probably codes that civil servants need to abide by and social media guidelines, and perhaps those need another look, but I can't speak directly to those.
Professor McEwen?
Nothing to add.
Can I ask why?
Again, I, as you know, I've not been feeling very well, so I'm vaguely aware of the issue that you're raising. But I don't particularly feel expert enough in social media codes and civil service codes to comment on that.
Given your long history involved in Scottish devolution, which the Chair was very kind to point out earlier on, I mean, have you seen examples?
I'm not a social media expert.
No, but have you seen examples in the past 25 years, of the government taking quite a party political stance in terms of what they say, rather than leaving that to the political party?
So I think government messaging from all of the governments I think it's probably a fuzzy line, I suppose. Okay. When is the boundaries of government, and you see that across all of the administrations, but I'm not an expert on the regulations that govern the civil service. I suppose one thing I would add is that, and leaving aside that particular issue, is that the system, particularly post-Brexit, but also post-2016 settlement, the system is incredibly much more complex than it was before. And I do think that, I know you've talked before about secondments and things and fostering understanding of devolution. I think there is an ongoing need to foster understanding even within the administrations of the complexities of the settlement, and I would say that across the administrations. So yeah.
And finally, from me, if I can, I'll go first to you, Dr. Brown-Swan. If we look at 25 years on, the Scottish Parliament up and running now has been sitting for 25 years since the 1998 Act. Where has Scottish devolution in the Scottish Parliament done well, and where can it still do better? And just off the top of my head, I'm looking at committees. We have a a robust exchange here. We have a chair, whether you like him or not. We have this chair elected by this House. It's very different in Holyrood, where the government have a majority and they're appointed. We've previously in this session with other witnesses looked at the dual role of the Lord Advocate in Scotland, being the head of public prosecutions and also a member of the Cabinet. Are these areas that are actually positive in Scotland and could be better down here, or better here in, could be improved in Scotland, or vice versa, or anything else that you think 25 years on, here's what could be done differently to improve devolution in Scotland? Dr. Brown-Swan.
Sure. I don't. I'll refrain from making a sweeping verdict on devolution, but I think there are issues in every political system, and the way that we grapple with those issues and discuss those issues is really, really important. I think every institution, particularly an institution that is kind of moving into that maturity, probably needs an opportunity to reflect and consider, and that's for the parliamentarians themselves to say what's working, what isn't working, and I would like to see kind of more discussion and perhaps a bit more creative thinking perhaps on devolution and the way that the Parliament functions and works. I teach Scottish politics every year and kind of do this whistle-stop tour of the early years of devolution, and we talk about the Rainbow Parliament, and we talk about those first principles and those ideals of the Scottish Parliament. And I think it's always a good idea at these kind of milestone moments to pause and reflect and say, have we met these ideals in terms of openness and inclusivity, etc.? So rather than kind of render a judgment, just perhaps some questions to consider.
And I think on that, just before I go to Professor McEwen, we have had different iterations of the Scotland Act since 1998, which has devolved more powers. We haven't actually changed anything in the Holyrood Parliament over the same period. So maybe that is something that we should look at. Professor McEwen.
Yeah, thank you. If I can think of one thing where I think the Scottish Parliament might learn from or emulate the Westminster Parliament would be around the committee chairs, and I would like to see more robust committees. If elected, I would quite like to see and at least an experiment with elected chairs to see if that invests more authority in the chair and more resources given to the committees as well. You talked about the increased responsibilities from each iteration of devolution, but it's the same number of parliamentarians doing a much bigger scrutiny job. So I know it's not a very popular position to suggest that you might need more parliamentarians, but I actually think you do. I think you're stretched far too thinly across a range of really important areas of responsibility. The one strength that you might want to look at and consider for a future UK Parliament is electoral reform. We now have over 25 years experience of proportional representation, and I think it's been a positive thing in the Scottish Parliament. It would have functioned in a very, very different way had it been the same system. So should that debate once again emerge, I think there's lots to be learned from the devolved institutions in thinking about how that might work and how it might work well. There are clearly some challenges around the operation of the Scottish Parliament, and actually let me rephrase that. There are some challenges around the operation of the devolution, but a lot of those are not to be found in the Scottish Parliament. One of the striking things about devolution in the UK is that it happened somewhere else outside of it. It happened in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. By and large, the centre carried on as before. And I think if the system is to work well, and particularly as the governance of England becomes more complex, as I anticipate it will in the years to come, I think there needs to be some imaginative thinking within Whitehall about how it restructures itself to adapt to what is now quite a complex multi-level system of government.
Thank you both very much. Thank you, Chair.
Just coming back to the UK Internal Market Act, I just want to get your impressions and views about this. Obviously, it's not proven to be all that popular amongst devolved parliaments and assemblies, and it's both the Welsh and Scottish governments refused to give legislative consent, and the Welsh even initiating legal challenges to the Act. What does this suggest to you both about the UK's approach to managing internal markets across the United Kingdom, obviously they're assuming the responsibilities of the European Union in areas that were devolved and operated under EU law. Is it working? Is it fit for purpose? And could we expect more disputes around it? And I'll start with you, Professor McEwen, with that one.
Yeah, so Corey and I just last week held a constitutional policy lab to look at the United Kingdom Internal Market Act 3 years on, and to reflect on whether there was a more consensual model going forward, because one of the fundamental problems around the UKIM Act was that it reshaped devolution in quite fundamental ways without the consent of the devolved institutions, and so it was not a good starting point in that sense. But we also took into that session an understanding that the issue was real, that leaving the European Union did create new challenges around how you balance political autonomy with a domestic market and market unity, because that issue is also very important. But we came up with a number of suggestions. We'd be happy to share those with the committee around ways that you might, either within the context of the legislation, introduce some amendments that can help to rebalance things a bit, or indeed in the intergovernmental system and processes that are ways that you can operate and deal with these new challenges, these real challenges, but on a more consensual basis.
Okay, thank you. And we've got Dr. Brown-Swan, who I'm sure is very keen to give us a couple of examples. But just before we do, is the general sense when it comes to UKIMA, this is something that's been done to the devolved parliaments and assemblies? Is that the general impression? I think it kicks around Cardiff and Edinburgh particularly.
I think the devolved parliaments would certainly say so. They withheld their consent, and ultimately it was passed with some changes, with some amendments, but that consent was withheld. And you see that in the political discourse around the UK Internal Market Act. When we think about the importance of goodwill and trust, I think the process by which the Act was passed did have a negative impact on that sense of goodwill and trust. Managing an internal market is very complex. There needed to be some sort of legislation to underpin an internal market and prevent kind of dramatic challenge or the economic consequences of inconsistencies within the internal market. But now we have it, and the question is, as we tried to explore last week, we kind of began with identifying the problems and then encouraging people to look forward to those solutions. There needs to be a way of working, and perhaps it can be improved by closer relationships.
I think this committee would be very interested in your work on this issue, so anything you can provide to us I think would be very helpful, given that we are looking at this in the current condition of intergovernmental relations. Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks to both witnesses for being here. I just wanted to pick up on the sort of tail end of Douglas Ross's aspects around what we can do to improve things. And we touched on select committees, but I wonder actually, given that the select committee's role in some respects is to, basically scrutinise the work of the Scotland office, what role do we think the Scotland office and the Wales office and Northern Ireland office should have in these ways of working? As in, how should they be delivering it? So, Dr. Brown-Swan, because in some ways I see them as interlocutors, but I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they could be quite effective interlocutors in terms of serving as kind of an intermediary, expressing, being someone to call, to express your views, to engage with on kind of these thorny political issues. You have seen a degree of engagement, but perhaps that could be expanded over time. And that's a kind of issue not just in Scotland, where the constitutional issue looms large, but in Wales and Northern Ireland as well.
And Professor McEwen, would you agree with that?
I think that the value of the Scotland office is to ensure that Scotland, if there are any particular interests in Scotland around areas of reserved policy, that these are reflected in decision making at cabinet level. obviously, there's also a responsibility for overseeing and maintaining the devolution settlement as a departmental responsibility, and that's functioning appropriately. As an interlocutor, I'm not so sure. Certainly, the governments, the devolved governments, tend to prefer and nurture portfolio level relationships, and I don't think that's new. It was interesting that Lord Wallace also said that in his experience as a minister as well, and I think they see more value in those direct relationships. But I think if it was a more cooperative relationship than the one we currently have, then there might be possibilities to unlock some things. But I don't.
I mean, I think that's part of the challenge for me. In terms of, I absolutely see that you would want to get those relationships from a portfolio perspective, but then for me that leaves what does the Scotland office do, and what's it responsible for? And I think that's one of the challenges. What do you see it should be doing, Professor McEwen?
I mean, I'm ambivalent actually as to whether there is continued value in separate territorial offices, or whether we might want to think about whether there's a better structure there around a senior minister that has overall responsibility for the territorial union or the territorial constitution. I don't have a particularly strong view either way. I do still think there is value because there are an awful lot of reserve policy areas that have an impact within Scotland, and sometimes the issues for Scotland are not necessarily the same as they would be for other parts of the UK. So having a voice there that can reflect that. Now, I don't know the extent to which the Scotland office does that right now, but I think that is potentially still an important role, whether it's as a standalone or whether it's within a sort of constitutional affairs.
I mean, I think it's interesting if I think about the committee inquiries that we've conducted. I think the committee inquiries have reflected those areas where there is reserved issues, but Scotland has an interest. So that's interesting to reflect on. If I can just come back round to common frameworks, I recall when we were previously discussing this and the progress of the Internal Market Act and questioning Paul Scully, who was the Bayes Minister then, it was almost as if the position was that if the common frameworks are set up properly, the need for an Internal Market Act would be much diminished. And I remember trying to get the Minister to come up with an imaginary product or service that wouldn't be in a common framework, but therefore would require the Internal Market Act. Do we think that we've not focused sufficiently on the common frameworks, given how so many are still in place provisionally? Dr. Swan-Brown?
I think there's always a need for some sort of overarching understanding of the UK internal market and of the management of the internal market. And we see this when we look at comparative examples, similar provisions or provisions to maintain some degree of economic coherence whilst respecting autonomy of devolved or decentralized states. But I think the common frameworks are quite interesting, and they're an area in which intergovernmental relations works quite well. So perhaps that was undervalued in that process. But I think Nicola has a much more kind of experience with those common frameworks.
Professor McEwen.
I mean, I think common frameworks, when they were initially conceived, were probably thought, at least from the UK government's perspective, in a slightly different way. So I think they were perhaps envisaged something that was more of a common regulatory framework, whereas they have by and large evolved to become ways of working and more about process of working collaboratively and processes of sharing when things are happening in a distinctive way. And I think that's part of the explanation for why we moved from there to a feeling that there was a need for a legal underpinning for the domestic market. One thing I would add, because it's become really complex now, how frameworks are governed and how the interministerial groups operate and how the UK internal market is governed. And there's a real need, I think, to integrate those ways of working intergovernmentally, because they're all over the place, and that makes your job in scrutinising them all the harder.
Is that why we think the DRS situation ended up where it was, because there was that degree of complexity and confusion, and where the Scottish Government went to, could it be agreed via a common framework? Did it need to get an Internal Market Act exemption? Is that one of the reasons why we ended up where we did? Professor McEwen?
So those processes are integrated. So a framework, a common framework agreement, is the route to an exemption under the UK Internal Market Act. But there needs to be, I think, a lot more clarity on how you go about doing that, the timescale of doing that, the different actors involved at that, and at which stage, just so that it all becomes a little bit more efficient and less politicised, actually, and that nobody's wasting their time. Because there's a lot of one of the things that came up last week when we talked about this from business and from the environmental sector was the deep uncertainty that all of this has created for people, where they just don't know what the regulatory field is going to look like, and I think that's very unfortunate.
Yes, yeah, and I think, Dr. Bringswan, that's back to that acceptance of the work that you've done, and your meeting last week was that this was the reality, that Brexit has created a new situation, and it does feel that for business that they've been on that journey too. Would you accept that?
Yes, absolutely. And they stressed the need for concern and for certainty, but they also stressed an acceptance that things might diverge, and that there might be divergence in a multi-level system, but they needed time and they needed certainty.
And so that they could make the right competitive decisions. Thanks very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Alan Brown.
Thanks, Chair. So just returning briefly to the Internal Market Act and some other legislation where obviously the Volden administration's withheld their LCM and the UK Government still introduced it. Is it fair to say in the current climate the Seoul Convention is almost dead in the water? Start with yourself, Dr. Brown-Swan.
I don't think so. I think it was damaged. It was very much tested by the Brexit process. I would hate to be kind of unequivocal. It worked for so long. So we saw that period pre-Brexit where only there were 140 LCMs lodged and only one of them was rejected. I think as we move out of perhaps these less contentious political waters of Brexit and we kind of begin to work within that new structure, perhaps we can go back at least to a degree to an understanding of Seoul and an understanding of a need.
So what needs to be done to get confidence back in the Seoul Convention that it had been restored?
Sorry?
What needs to be done to restore confidence for the devolved administrations that the Seoul Convention will be restored effectively or will become the normal working arrangement?
Sure. So I think we need those commitments facilitated by good intergovernmental relations, and some clarity on what normally means. Normally is doing a lot of work in that in the Seoul Convention. So what does normally mean? And is there an obligation on the UK government to seek consent or to receive consent? So I think Seoul probably needs revisiting in a pretty significant way. But it has worked successfully in the past, and I don't think we should kind of write it off because it's not quite clear what the alternative would be.
It's revisiting in a significant way. I mean, Professor Jim Gallagher, who used to work in the Scotland office, I mean, he told the committee that basically what happened after the Internal Market Act and other legislation is leaving the argument for strengthening the Seoul Convention unanswerable. So he thinks actually a lot more needs to be done. So what would that look like?
You might see some sort of memorandum of understanding, which would outline areas in which Seoul would be exercised, or areas in which the UK Parliament would normally legislate. That could be spelled out in greater degree. But I think it's also can we reset that process going forward? It's an outstanding question, but if you had political will to do so, Seoul could perhaps be re-entrenched.
Professor McEwen, do you have anything to add or your thoughts on where the Seoul Convention is at and what needs to be done to restore confidence?
Yeah, so there aren't easy answers to this. It is the subject of our next Constitutional Policy Lab, so we will be able to be more forthcoming at that point too. But I think it's absolutely crucial that this is addressed, because the Sewell Convention was the way to combine devolution with continued parliamentary sovereignty. So if you want to have those two things running in tandem, we have to find ways to restore confidence in the Sewell Convention. Now, I don't think it's dead in the water in that it is still used routinely, but it has lost its power. It's lost its power if there is the broad understanding that withholding consent won't mean what it once meant, in that if legislation is going to happen anyway. So some of the, what could you actually do? I think in addition to the things that Corey has already suggested, I think there is a job of work to be done within the House of Commons in particular, but the Lords too, to think through procedurally what is the responsibility of the UK Parliament when consent is withheld. How do you want to introduce and implement and observe the Sewell Convention? Is there a willingness to revisit the legislation, or to carve out areas, or to work together with the devolved institutions to try to get towards a position where they can, whatever the stumbling blocks, can they be amended and addressed to secure consent? And if not, are there ways that you might have an opt-out? But there's some sort of procedural process that I think cannot be beyond the wit of us to design, to try to give it meaning, restore its authority, where withholding consent is meaningful again. So that doesn't really answer your question, but I think it is really important.
That maybe leads to then, we've got the new dispute resolution mechanism that hasn't actually been used yet. Does that have any basis for actually helping underpin or resolve these things, or is that just a wish? So I'll start with yourself, Professor McHugh, and then I'll come to
So I think that the new dispute resolution process in the context of the intergovernmental machinery, so no, it hasn't really been used much, and that might be a reflection of the fact that the machinery hasn't been used all that much. So when disputes emerge, they tend to emerge in the world of politics. They're not emerging within there. I think the one positive thing about that new process is that it addresses the problem with the previous version of dispute resolution, in that any administration can raise a dispute, and it has to be recognised as a dispute if they are raising it. So that seems a basic point, but that was one of the biggest problems with the previous incarnation of that. The Sewell Convention is, of course, a legislative process, not fundamentally an intergovernmental one, although I think if you get to the point of consent being withheld via Sewell processes, that is a failure of intergovernmental relations, because ideally you would have addressed the problems and the concerns that led to that withholding of consent at a much, much earlier stage in the process. So I think the two things are related, but I'm not sure. I think the dispute resolution mechanism is a positive thing, but I don't think it helps us address some of the issues around Sewell.
Thanks. Dr. Brown-Swan, you want to add about it?
Sure. So I think I agree with Nicola that it is a positive thing, and we won't really know until we see it play out in practice. Perhaps the fact that you have to lodge a formal dispute perhaps encourages a bit better intergovernmental working, because there is kind of a emergency stop button where governments can feel enabled to negotiate and try to avoid such a situation, but there is something available to them in that process. But again, we don't really know exactly how that will work.
No, and that's a hypothetical, so still to see it play out, but is there not instinctively it might be the UK government's going to be the majority partner within that dispute resolution, so what's to stop them actually always having the final say as the largest partner, as it were?
I do think there are some provisions built into that dispute resolution. There's not a ton of detail about how that works exactly just yet, but I do think there's provisions so the disputing party can't be the first or second chair. I think the fact that you have a multilateral intergovernmental relationship can perhaps help. Northern Ireland is always very complex, but we have seen quite strong working together between Scotland, Scottish and Welsh governments, and they might have similar concerns. So I think you could see some positive outcomes as a result of that process.
Really, we need more detail. We need to see how it plays out in practice
absolutely.
as a reality.
Yeah.
Okay. Changing tack slightly. So, in terms of powers of the Scottish Parliament, we're told within the UK environment that the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Assembly, is the most powerful devolved administration in the world. Is there any academic or scientific basis behind such assertions?
Yes, so there's a kind of measure, there's almost a league table of devolved versus, or of shared rule versus self-rule in decentralised contexts. I can't remember exactly where Scotland sits on this, but it really depends on what issue areas we're talking about. Scotland has quite extensive powers over education in contrast to the Canadian provinces, etc. So I think it's difficult to kind of create a direct indicator or measure of that. The Scottish Parliament certainly has quite significant powers.
It's a label, it's hard to actually prove, to say the least. Professor McEwen, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes. So going back to that split between self-rule and shared rule, think of self-rule as the powers and responsibilities of the laws that can be made within Scotland, within devolved competence, and then shared rule being the ability to influence those areas that intersect with devolution. So comparatively, I think it is fair to say that the powers of the Scottish Parliament are up there amongst some of the most powerful sub-state institutions in the self-rule category, but in their ability to influence in that shared rule category, they're much lower down the league table, if you like. There's always controversies around how we measure these things, and it's not an exact science in that sense, but I think it really depends on the lens that you take. But I think it is a powerful institution. One of the ironies, I suppose, is that the more powerful it has become, the more vulnerable it is to decisions taken at the UK government level over which they have no control. So around fiscal autonomy, for example, the 2016 settlement gave a lot of powers over income tax, as you know, a lot of powers over aspects of social security, and by and large, a lot of responsibility over both of those areas. And that left them, in a sense, more exposed perhaps to decisions over, say, macroeconomic policy that is reserved, that might affect revenues, that might affect the economy, that might affect capacity, work-based capacity, and all of those. So I do think there are quite fundamental problems with the 2016 settlement that we might need to revisit at some point, because I think those problems might accumulate as the years go on.
So just on that, before I ask what you think needs to be visited, but actually right now we've got the arguments about the budget. So as a fact that the bloc, so obviously despite the additional powers you said that came from the 2016 Act, as a fact that the Scottish bloc grant's now been cut 2 years in a row in terms of real terms when compared to inflation, does there need to be something? So we spoke about the clash of legislation. There needs to be something done to improve the budget setting process, because quite clearly, in terms of the block grant, what happens, you have the autumn statement, the Chancellor stands up, he makes an announcement and says, here's the money that's going to the Scottish Government, and here's some Barnett consequentials as well, so we're grateful for the Barnett consequentials. But the Scottish Government's got no sight of that. There's no discussions on need, and clearly Barnett actually comes from the Chancellor determining how he spends and assesses needs in England and Wales, and then Scotland gets a cut through the Barnett. But that's not looking at the needs of Scotland, and the Scottish Government's got no say in that in terms of that block grant. So, as well as the powers, does there need to be a more collaborative way of working in terms of budget setting?
Yeah, it's certainly, I think, so the Scottish Government and now the Welsh Government are in this space too, are having to make budget decisions in response to decisions that are taken by the Treasury. And the more responsibility you have there, the more significant those decisions will be. So I don't know where, I know the Fisc has been meeting. I don't know the extent to which that process is working or not working. I think the relationship with the tax authorities is very positive, but at ministerial level, I'm not sure. So that's, it'd be interesting to see that in further evidence. But if I can just touch on the powers a little bit, because just as by way of illustration, so obviously there's been a lot of discussion around how the tax decisions that the Scottish Government will make, and income tax bands and thresholds are devolved, but income tax policy is not, and savings and dividends is not. So you have such a lot of responsibility being placed on that one source of revenue, and actually not that many high earners in Scotland that can help to plug a gap, if you like, and there's debates about whether that's the right way to go anyway. But what the Scottish Government has to be mindful of is that it's not as simple as setting the rate and then expecting the revenues to flow, because there are opportunities there for example, people to shift income into savings and dividends, which is not devolved. So you might actually lose some revenue as a result of that rather than gain. So it becomes very difficult to forecast. The reason I said that I think that the settlement might need revisited is because of some of the longer term forecasts that the Scottish Fiscal Commission have produced, that suggest that particularly around the massive element of the budget is of course on the NHS, and the NHS is one of those things that when it becomes more successful, it becomes more expensive, because as medicines improve and so on, and expectations increase. But also around social security, it's difficult to see the costs of financing the system of social security going in any other direction other than upward pressures. And of course, the more upward pressures on that budget, then the more pressures there are in other areas as well. So I think there's just a dispassionate reflection, I think, on the 2016 settlement would, I think, be timely and important.
Is there, have you any sense, any political will in terms of looking at that and around, because obviously clearly that involves the UK government, it changes again to what's currently reserved matters presumably, so has there been any serious discussion that you're aware of?
Not at the moment, but I suppose what I would want to suggest is that there's never, like, every time there is a new settlement, it always comes with the kind of some sort of description like is built to last or something like that. And my own view of these things is that the system ought always to evolve, because things happen. We learn from experiences. We see how things operate in practice once they're introduced. New things come along like Brexit, like COVID, that expose some of the maybe some of the weaknesses as well as some of the strengths. So I think it's appropriate that we build into our scrutiny periodic reviews, just to see how things are working, and maybe that would be a better way than letting politics always be the driver.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. I just round off, we said we'd come back to transparency, and it was a really big feature of the review into government relations announced in January 2022. And I just wonder your thoughts about this, because there does seem to be quite a considerable variation in the level of detail included in communiques for different interministerial groups. What do you think should be the type of information that are included in these communiques, and what would be ideal practice when it comes to that? And I'll come to you first, Dr. Brown-Swan.
I think there is a need for more information, but there's also a need that governments can speak and ministers can speak, quite frankly, with one another. So it is a difficult tension or a difficult balance to maintain. But I think in terms of the communiques, and they have expanded a bit in length from when we first started looking at this. We need to know who was present. We need to know the substance and the different positions, if any decisions were taken, if any concrete outputs or agreement came out of those. I think it will help with the Secretariat. I mean, there's been a vast improvement in the information available since the signing of the Intergovernmental Agreement, and hopefully the Secretariat will help consolidate and ensure that information is available.
Should this be a matter exclusively for the Secretariat, or is it just now? I mean, I'm presuming that there will be input from ministerial partners, those that are intending. How does it actually work just now about how we see what's included in these communiques?
Sure. So we've seen kind of a variety of processes, some of which have been informed by the MOUs adopted between the Scottish Parliament and Scottish Government and the Senate and the Welsh Government, where they made a commitment to share those communiques and to kind of open those intergovernmental relations up to scrutiny. So we can see kind of a changing process. In other decentralized states, we see independent secretariats who are responsible for both coordinating meetings and putting out agreed outputs from those.
Thank you. And you've got a view what should be included, Professor McEwen, in these communiques? Please.
Yes. I think the best one is not actually one of the new ones. It's the Joint Ministerial Working Group on Welfare, which is a bilateral UK government, Scottish government one. And the reason that I think it's the best one is not only because it actually gives you some detail of what is under discussion, but the structure of it. It starts with action points brought forward from the last one. It ends with a summary of action points. And so that you can see what actually happened, and you get the follow through, which certainly from my interviews was one of the major frustrations with a lot of intergovernmental meetings, is that, you know, issues would be raised, the minister would say, I'll take that away, and then nobody ever knew if anything actually happened. So having that follow on, I think, is a really positive thing. I have to say, I think the information available is much better than it was, despite transparency not really featuring prominently in the review's conclusions, but there is certainly a lot more information available, and it is variable. Where there is still a weakness, I think, is in the formal role given to Parliament to oversee things.
I know Mr. Ross wants to come in.
Yeah, it's just something that I asked one of our previous panels. How interesting, obviously, we all get very excited when we speak about intergovernmental affairs and communiques and such like, and with your students, I'm sure they will be interested. What is the wider public understanding or interest above they just want both their governments to work well together to deliver for them? Is there enough interest or understanding, or is this actually something that, you know, should be left to the back rooms to just work out behind the scenes and the public just get the public services that they want? Professor McEwen.
So I think there is an interest, not necessarily in the minutiae of the processes, but I think there is an interest in seeing that they work together. Or that they cooperate to deal with stuff. And that is fundamentally about intergovernmental procedures. But more than that, I think the more complex everything becomes, it's really important to accountability. If there is more transparency around who said what and what they did or didn't do, because then, you know, it's core to the democratic process, right? That without the transparency around that, then we are left with the he said, she said political claims of each administration. So I think there is a sort of democratic duty around that too.
And who should take that forward? Is it for the governments to try and promote this more? Is it for this committee? Who does that rest with? And I would also say we had evidence last week from Lawrence Rocky, the senior civil servant in the Scotland office, who cited the figure, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, but there is still a large proportion of Scottish voters who believe the UK Parliament is responsible for their health service, despite it being fully devolved to Scotland since 1999. So are there bigger issues that we have to overcome first before we can speak more about intergovernmental arrangements?
I don't necessarily see it as an ordering issue in that sense. So, I mean, I think particularly relating to the points I was making about accountability, the more transparency there is around that, the more we might be able to nurture that sense of understanding of devolution and how it operates. So yeah, I don't think it's an either or.
Mm-hmm. And on who it rests, whose job is it?
Yeah, so everybody's. So I think it's our job as academics in terms of that, science communication. I think there is a role for the Secretariat. One of the disappointments for me, I noticed in the terms of reference for the Secretariat that were published quite recently, is that it is very much being set up as something that serves the governments in conducting their relationship. So there's an obligation to produce an annual report, but then that goes to the governments and it's up to them to decide how they present that to parliaments. I would like to see more of a robust secretariat that can come to yourselves, that can and should and ought to present to lay the report before Parliament, so that you can have more of a requirement of parliamentary oversight rather than leaving it for committees to decide that they want to do that.
Thanks, Nicola. Just lastly, I know when you guys come to our committee, it's always a list of complaints where it's not working, or grievances about process and how things could be done better. But there is examples where working between two governments have worked, and like we've got examples here of green Freeport City region deals, investment zones. Why do they seem to work well, and other matters of where all the different governments across the UK might not reach that high standard? And you got thought about that? First time I've had silence from either of them.
Sorry, I was trying to figure out how to put it diplomatically. I think if someone comes to you with money, you can be perhaps a bit more open. No one, particularly in this very constrained environment, is
it's all about giving money to lots of people. Is that how
there is an element of that. Although I know Mark Drakeford was really critical of shared prosperity funds, which were viewed as a way of bypassing devolution. So I think there is a risk there. There's a risk of a sense of a UK government exerting
we did get a chance to explore some of that because of the tight agenda. But have you got any thoughts about that, Professor McEwen? Why is it work? Is it all about communities getting money for things that they like to do?
No, I mean I think that's part of it. I mean, with the levelling up funding, for example, that didn't quite work out the way Lord Dunlop recommended it should. So in his report, you might recall that it was envisaged that would be a collaborative thing. And I think, there's maybe some thought to go back to something like that as we reset intergovernmental relations. But I mean, I said at the very beginning, some positive examples that weren't really about the money at all, but where there were joint challenges that spanned devolved reserved competence. So the Homes for Ukraine, or when we had the COP in Glasgow a couple of years ago, or the fiscal framework, so there are things where there are concrete things to work on and urgencies that often brings people together collaboratively, where they can set aside something.
I thought I'd try and end it on a reasonably positive note, and I'm glad that you both of you played along with it reasonably well. But so we'll leave it there. I think there's a couple of things you're going to send through to the committee. Your joint work that you're doing on Yakima, I think it was. You said you would maybe help this committee with, if that's possible. But again, and Professor McEwen, thank you. I don't know how many times you've attended this committee, but we always enjoy your presence here and your very helpful contributions, and I hope you're better soon and get back full fighting fit. So for today, order has ended.